Thanks so much, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm glad you chose to participate in this workshop. Super excited about being part of Stormwater Awareness Week. Stormwater is a big part of who I am, what I do, and the reason I do what I do. And so when I saw this pop up, I certainly wanted to contribute to it and hopefully share some useful information for those who are participating in today's workshop. So hopefully everyone can see my slides okay. And we're going to dive right in. So the topic of this workshop is the 2021 Green Infrastructure Designer Survey. So today we're going to talk about some of the results or feedback from a survey that I conducted with a whole bunch of green infrastructure designers back in 2021, which seems like forever ago now, but last summer. And then sort of once I got all the data, compiled it together, and have spent some time this year at a number of conferences and events such as this, sharing some of the lessons learned. And I think for those who are in that green infrastructure designer space, some of the feedback will hopefully be helpful or challenge you to think about things a little bit differently as you approach your green stormwater projects. But a little background first. Who am I? Again, I'm Rob Woodman, professional engineer with a few other different certifications there too. This is my wife and 4 kids, Sebago Lake, Maine. I live up in the Northeast in the state of Maine. And I actually grew up in Australia, so I have a slightly funny accent. We get little bits of the crocodile hunter mixed in with some kind of Maine lumberjack of some sort. But ultimately, I tell my kids that I'm a defender of natural resources. I've worked in consulting, done a lot of different things throughout my career, and now leading a national green infrastructure initiative at FERGUSON WATERWORKS, feel like I have the best opportunity to impact natural resources to the greatest extent possible. And the big why, obviously, you saw my kids are thinking about like the next generation and the generation after them, and trying to protect all these wonderful resources that we have that are often threatened by polluted stormwater volume and I guess quality and quantity issues, and that obviously becomes a big driver impetus to the whole implementation of green infrastructure in many places throughout the country. I work for a company called Ferguson WaterWorks. I'm actually on the product side of things, which is a bit weird. I worked in consulting for 10 years. In the last 8, I've been more on the innovative products and technology side of things. So we have a footprint all over the country. And my specific charge with me and my team is to essentially be solution providers, help civil engineers, landscape architects, municipalities come up with solutions to their wet weather challenges. A little bit more of my background, just so you can kind of see some of the experience I've had and kind of what ultimately led me to putting the survey together. So like I mentioned, I was on the consulting side for the first 10 years of my career. I did civil engineering at university, actually in Australia, and then moved to the US shortly after. My wife grew up in the Boston area, so she dragged me back over here. The last now 8 years, that note's a little outdated, but been working more on the products and technology side of things. And ultimately, again, supporting engineers, landscape architects, municipalities, and more recently, some of the city-scale green infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure. If you hear the word GSI, it's Green Stormwater Infrastructure. That's that acronym, if that's new. I was with a company called ACF Environmental, small company that was acquired by Ferguson about 2 years ago now. So went from a 250-person company to about 32,000 overnight, which is quite a step up. On top of that, I also, in my spare time, which is very little these days, I do third-party inspections on a variety of sites, commercial and residential sites throughout southern Maine, where I live. And this gives me a unique opportunity to see how systems are performing after installation, look at the impact of maintenance, what systems need more maintenance than others, balancing that function with feature on some of these green stormwater systems. And that's really helped develop some of my knowledge base too. And like all cool kids these days, I have a blog. It's called Libit. You can check that out on YouTube if you want, where I kind of have a bunch of short videos of just different things I see out there in the crazy world of stormwater. But ultimately, if you put all this together, I have this unique opportunity to see and observe a lot of challenges that go beyond the typical engineering plan. And that really is why I came to this survey. No matter where you go out throughout the country, everyone's kind of dipping their toes in this green stormwater space. Looking at different ways to incorporate permeable surfaces, bioretention, rain gardens, all kinds of surface stormwater features into areas that were typically just there for conveyance, and discharge. And again, no matter where you go, whether you're Philly, Pittsburgh, New York, DC, over on the West Coast as well. I know there's a few folks on here from the West Coast. Everyone kind of has their own unique approach, but is ultimately trying to balance, the gray infrastructure and the green infrastructure and coming up ways to manage their specific wet weather challenges. When you get into urban settings, there's a lot of complexities, and this is probably no surprise, right? You're dealing with tight spaces, you're dealing with other infrastructure or other utilities nearby. Construction can often affect local businesses and access during the period of time, so there's a need to be very efficient with the installation of these types of systems. And it's not about just digging a hole and throwing this stuff in the ground. There's a need to actually make sure it's working. So monitoring, metrics, and maintenance, right? The word we all hate to hear. But these systems do need to be maintained, just like anything in your lives, if they're going to be thriving and survive. The other thing that's interesting when you get into these tight urban settings is we've got to kind of get the functional stormwater piece handled, whether it's conveyance or storage or treatment. But we also need to look good too, right? Rain gardens, fire retention. There's an expectation from the public that if we're going to put this thing in, it's going to be a feature, it's going to add value. And it's challenging to get both of those two things done all in one. And what I keep finding is we've got great research and academic groups out there researching stormwater BMPs. We've got the design community, we've got the maintenance community, but they're not always all working together. And so I always just ask folks the question, are we taking what we learned from the field back to the next design? Is that driving what our research is, impacting our design, and hopefully overcoming the challenges around cost and ease of maintenance? So again, going back to all that experience, I guess as I was talking to engineers, started to kind of believe some perceived shortcomings in collaboration in these sorts of projects, right? So when you think about it, right, the designers and the owners interacting well, the civil engineers, the landscape architects, explaining to their developers, their owners, their municipal customers, perhaps what these BMPs are, how they function, and more importantly, what kind of maintenance is needed. I noticed between design team members as well, like civil engineers and landscape architects, maybe not working in a lot of cases as well as they could, and that often falls on the civil engineer waiting until very, very late in the project to engage the landscape architect to look through the planting design. We're going to touch on that today. I also started to notice that a lot of bid documents, so a lot of projects that are hitting the street for bidding, well, maybe only like 30 to 50% drawings, and so they lacked all that detail that's needed to get good, well-informed bids. And sometimes the extra detail was never being added. So we end up with confusion in the field or things like that. See less engineers, especially young engineers and designers, getting out in the field. So that's something that I think we just have to identify as a challenge. We need to work on that. We'll touch on that today. Maintenance, that's going to keep coming up today as well. And then I think just generally, and I'll put myself in this bucket too, as an engineer, thinking about projects sort of in one direction, right? Going from design to permitting, bidding, award, installation, maybe maintenance if people are doing it. And that's kind of the end of the line, right? But are we taking what we learn? Are we having maintenance drive design, right? Are we taking what we learn in the field and having it back, come back to the front end and change the way we approach the next project? I'm not sure that we are. And the challenge is when we don't collaborate well, we don't get good outcomes in green infrastructure, right? We get all these systems that, there was such good intent in the design process, but none of these things are probably going to bode too well for the public. And we say, yeah, let's do more green infrastructure, right? And that leads to a lot of frustration. And with frustration can often come the slowing of the furtherance of green infrastructure. Comparatively, I've got some photos here. Actually, I just got these photos yesterday, so I wanted to put them on a slide. Right? When things are done well, these systems can be absolute magic to look at, right? So these are some biofilters we worked on in Eastern PA, a little project called Center Square Commons, right in the middle of town. These are attractive. These are functional. Actually, I posted something on LinkedIn before, and a person I know in the engineering world said, you wouldn't even know they're there to treat stormwater. I think that was such a fantastic comment, right? Because it just fits in so well. It complements things aesthetic. We've got these rocks and seating and all these types of things around it. That's so much better than most of the ones on the board here, right? So how do we get to these types of solutions? Well, again, I think collaboration is key. Anyway, so again, I had all these thoughts about, are these things that could be done better, but why not ask the people, right? Why not ask designers and see, are these perceived shortcomings actually true or not? Or maybe I'm just being overly dramatic and I'm missing the point, right? So I set out to do a survey. The goal was to get useful feedback from the design community. I've got a great response from designers, as you'll see that throughout the responses today. You'll notice the questions are fairly simple, they're not perfect, and the answer options folks had, they're all kind of pre-selected answer options, pretty simple. So there's no magic to that, but I did kind of cover a lot of different things from design, construction, maintenance, and the overall connectivity or lack thereof between those things. And, you know, not to kind of spoil the conclusion on the front end, but unfortunately, a lot of the results confirmed things that I was expecting, but kind of hoping it wasn't true, right? I was kind of hoping to be pleasantly surprised. I'm not sure that it was. Anyway, so what I'm going to do today is go through the whole survey, each of the questions, the responses from each of those, and hopefully you'll find some of the feedback that I got from the survey useful. And ultimately, my goal when I do any of these types of presentations or workshops is to challenge you as I challenge myself to think about, okay, in our sphere of influence, right, and regardless of what role you play in a project like this, how can you be leaders in that space, right? How can you say, okay, I'm not going to sit back and wait for someone to say, let's collaborate, right? Maybe that could be you, or if you see someone sort of pushing that collaboration agenda, often that next person to follow is just as critical as the person who came up with the idea to start with. So just want to throw that out there on the front end. All right, so the 2021 GSI Designer Survey, we're going to go from start to finish and then talk a little bit about some lessons learned at the end. The only question I'm skipping over is question 1, because question 1 for those who completed the survey was, what's your email address? And I didn't really feel like it was really fair to share everyone's email addresses on this page. All right, so question 2. And actually, before I get into that, I should say, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to drop those in the chat box as well. We're going to get to those at the end, but any questions or comments or thoughts you have as we go along, pop those in the meeting chat, and we will get to those soon. So question 2 was, are you a civil engineer, a landscape architect, a municipal planner, or some other kind of professional? And I asked this strategically because I want to understand, okay, out of the feedback we're getting, you know, what sort of industry professionals are represented. So you look on the board here, 86% of folks are civil engineers, so very strong influence on the civil engineering side. I definitely would have liked to get a little bit more of that red wedge there with the landscape architects, because I think it's a very important voice that needs to be put into this survey data. But just to give you a sense of the folks here, it's mostly civil engineers. Question 3, what state are most of the design projects in? The way people completed this one was a little bit maybe contrary to the way I described it in the question. But I'd say what you get here is the idea that a lot of folks on this were East Coast. So if you're on the West Coast and you're calling in today, love to hear your thoughts too, and maybe reach out to me afterwards. This was predominantly the East Coast. And I think that's mostly because in the last 8 years or so of my career, I've been focused on the East Coast. Now in my national role in this urban green infrastructure space with Ferguson, I'm looking at the entire country. So moving forward, we'd certainly get more results from folks in other parts of the country. So let's talk about experience, right? Question 4, how many years of experience do you have? 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, or more than 15? I really liked this result because we've got over half the folks on this have over 15 years of experience, which I think is really interesting and kind of special for the data set, because you think about green infrastructure 15 years ago, probably a pretty new concept, really, right? There were some early adopters, early innovators, but for those who have been around for more than 15 years, they've probably seen the way some of this green infrastructure hype has evolved and changed. And so I like that there's a voice there, and obviously then a nice little group of others from, you know, in the early graduate new engineers through to project engineers and getting forward to more of those senior engineer positions. So a good mix of folks here. And again, nice to see the more experience contributing to this as well. Question 5, okay, are your design projects for public, private, or a little bit of both? And for those on the call who are consultants, there's probably no surprise here, right? A lot of municipalities are hiring or retaining the services of private engineering companies to do their design work. So it makes sense that that same group who might be designing the Dollar General down the street is also engaged in some linear green street projects for the local communities. So that's that. Question six was, what is the primary goal of your green stormwater infrastructure design? Is it water quantity, water quality, both quantity and quality, or streetscape beautification only? Let's see what the results are. All right, so here again, just a little wedge of green for streetscape beautification. 80% of folks, both on quantity and quality. This was kind of interesting to me because I feel like a lot of the city scale green infrastructure programs are mostly focused on volume. There's a few exceptions to that on the MS4 side, more focused on TMDLs and things like that. But this was really good to see and encouraging. And I think even if you are focused on volume, you're probably doing some treatment just as a way of pre-treatment, you know, to protect those, say, subsurface storage systems or vaults or tunnels, or using rain garden bioretention as a way to just create a surface expression of perhaps the storage below. So that was kind of interesting to see that. So again, a mix of quantity and quality. We start to dive a little bit deeper now. You know, let's talk about water quality. What are the pollutants that you're mostly designing to treat? Is it trash and debris, TSS, or total suspended solids, TSS and nutrients, so phosphorus, nitrogen, things like that, heavy metals, bacteria. If you look at the result here, you'll see 2/3 of folks on the TSS and nutrients. Makes sense. I think if we'd done this 3-4 years ago, it probably would have been more heavily TSS. I think more states have now graduated to a focus on mostly phosphorus, but then there's unique areas like we see in Florida where nitrogen is a big push. I love the fact that there was this little wedge of purple here on bacteria. I feel like bacteria is one of those emerging pollutants that we're seeing more and more down in Florida, Texas, West Coast, East Coast of New England, a huge outfall of these types of things. And I would suspect that if we were to conduct a survey again in a couple of years, that bacteria wedge, that purple segment would probably start to grow a little bit. That's certainly coming in. We on the innovative product side of things actually have a kind of sort of anticipating that. And we've actually got some new solutions and products that are specifically focused on bacteria and stormwater. And expect the demand for those to grow quite quickly here in the near future. All right, question 8. And this is just sort of a pause, a bit more of a personal reflection question, less technical in nature. Are you passionate about the connection between your design work and defending downstream natural resources? Yes, I am, kinda, or like, nah, it's just what I do for a job. And obviously some honest folks here in the yellow wedge. So this is great. You know, 2/3 of folks saying they're passionate. Obviously, passion can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So that's sort of open to interpretation. But ultimately, if we want to fully leverage the full potential of green stormwater infrastructure, low impact development, I think it's important for anyone who's designing these types of systems to be passionate about, to be excited about it. Because when you're excited about it, the client's excited about it. I think the focus and the, you know, around education and community benefits that starts to grow. And so, you know, if you're in this space or you know people in this space, you know, encourage them to get pumped up about it, because I think there's a lot more good work to be done out there to keep these natural resources from declining. So going a little bit further into that, question 9 was, do you believe that your designs connect with what's often called the triple bottom line co-benefits of green stormwater infrastructure? And those triple bottom line benefits are often known as environmental, social, and financial. Some of you may not be familiar with this. It's sort of a growing term within the stormwater community about this idea of, hey, it's not just about digging a hole in the ground, but what additional benefits can we get from these systems, right? Environmental is a more straightforward one, but when we talk about social impact or community gathering spaces or education around clean water, even financial incentives for green infrastructure, there's a lot of additional layers that can really help make green infrastructure far more exciting than just simply processing stormwater. So do you believe your design connect with the triple bottom line co-benefits? Absolutely, sometimes never, or I guess I don't really think about this. I did a keynote presentation at an event up in the Buffalo, New York area earlier in the year. There was about 200 people in the room. And I asked the question, who's even heard of the triple bottom line benefits of green infrastructure? And only a couple of hands were raised, like 3 or 4. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is something that if we're designing that space, we don't really know about this. It's something we want to dig into a little bit deeper. So again, 11% are like, I don't want to think about it. That's fair, right? But only 29% on the absolutely. And again, when we think about these co-benefits, right, we've got to think about pushing green infrastructure to a place where we can get more out of it than simply processing stormwater. So you think about this little diagram down here where there's this kind of nice overlap of some of the environmental and social and economical things. And when those come together, now you've really got some very cost-efficient ways to engage the community. And you look at the contrast between these two photos, right? This fire retention system here, there's people gathering, there's educational placards right here. It's a space that people want to be around, versus this other fire retention here where I don't think that maintenance worker is particularly happy to be out there because it's clogged quite a way after the storm event. Question 10. How often is the capacity of the practices you design oversized to address resiliency? Always, sometimes, never. Here we see that 20% are saying always. We're seeing more and more of this conversation around resiliency, and also this sort of idea that maybe green infrastructure initially wasn't understood to really contribute to resiliency, but it really does, because when you end up with this decentralized patchwork of systems throughout any kind of city or town, you get to a situation where you now have these small little areas that can hold water, slowly release them, reduce the burden on the downstream, maybe undersized storm drain conveyance systems, ponds, and things like that. And I think often folks find that green infrastructure in reality has more runoff reduction than it was modeled to have. So there's definitely some resiliency benefits. But going beyond that little side fact, are folks saying, hey, we could design it to treat an inch, but let's treat 2 inches, or let's treat 1.5 inches, or whatever it may be, while we're here. And you can see here that not yet, again, according to data, something that folks are doing a lot. But we find, especially in urban retrofit work, that if the cost to treat 1 inch, or if let's say you want to treat 2 inches versus 1 inch, the cost to treat 2 inches is generally not double the cost to treat 1 inch, right? Because you're already out in the field, you already have the equipment there, you're already digging the hole. Okay, yeah, your hole's a little bit bigger now, you need some additional materials to put in that hole. But it certainly doesn't double the cost of the project. Maybe it's an extra 30%, maybe it's extra 40%, whatever it may be. But when we think about this sort of ever-changing world of rainfall and the kind of events that we're getting these days, more intense, more frequent types of events, I think as a design community, we do have to think about ways that we could oversize things to anticipate some of that continuing change. Question 11. Do you include innovative and proprietary practices into your design? So this one was a bit selfish. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you joined us late, I'll let you know now, I do work on that product side of things. I was curious, how are folks approaching innovative technologies? They're always using them, sometimes when traditional aren't feasible, or never. So a little bit of never. There's always going to be a little never. I like this result, 85% of people, right? So and this is the way you want to approach things. You want to, exhaust all of those traditional practices before you feel like, okay, yeah, we need to look at some sort of new technology or more space efficient type things. And there's tons of options out there in the space. And so, anytime some manufacturer offers you to do offers to do a lunch and learn, or you're at a trade show, you can go to the exhibitors, like, go see those folks. Be up to speed on what's coming out, what's new, because that may well, then there will well be things you can add to your toolbox for projects that you have coming up and can offer to your client, and hopefully makes you more unique. Following on that same path, question 12, do you research new design approaches in green stormwater infrastructure, or stick to what you've used in the past? Always look for new approaches. Sometimes look for new approaches, but generally stick to what I've used, or never use new approaches. So let's look at the results there. Again, there's a little finger of yellow. I could probably go back and see who that was. Probably not a good idea for me to do that in the data set. But again, this is a good thing. I think, again, you kind of want this all to be a blue circle in the perfect world, because again, green stormwater infrastructure has evolved so much. It continues to evolve. You think about where we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even a year ago now, where we are and where it's heading. I think it's important to be equipped with the latest information and know what kind of options are out there, be updating details and changing things based on things that are in the field. All right, let's shift over to plants for a minute, and then I think we go into a few other topics, and we'll come back to plants later on in the survey. But question 13 was, and this is one I was a bit nervous about, and I'm sure some of you may be also, Do the civil engineer and landscape architect collaborate and work together in your design? Always, sometimes, or never. Let's see the results. Okay, so again, we're talking about green infrastructure. Not that all green infrastructure has plants, right? Could be permeable surfaces, could be some kind of other infiltration-based type of system. But if we think about rain gardens, bioretention, planters, grass filter strip, the planting part's pretty important, right? And unfortunately, the results say here that only 31% are always collaborating. That's something we have to change, right? Because when we have a civil engineer run world, we get the perfect rectangular rain garden with 90-degree corners and one plant species laid out in perfect rows and lines. And like, if you missed it, I'm a civil engineer myself, so I'm mocking myself when I say that. And I used to love a good 90-degree corner in a mulch bed. Or another civil engineering masterpiece, right? We would eliminate the plants altogether and just beef up the amount of riprap around the system. The civil engineers here, right? But let's flip it the other side, right? When you get to the landscape architecture side of things, sometimes landscape architects' design can be criticized for being a little bit too freeform in shape, with too many different species too closely spaced together. And when maintenance crews come out, they don't know what to plant, what to weed, and they end up deadheading the whole thing. So there's some happy medium there, right? Between a rain garden that has a little bit of visual interest and some shape, with maybe say 3 or 4 plant species laid out in decent spacing, so that it's clear to see what's meant to be there and what's not, and also so that you can like access the mulch or media surface for maintenance and things like that. So yeah, again, somewhere in the middle is the right mix, but landscape architects civil engineers really need to be working well together throughout the process. So, you know, what plants go in what kind of soils and what kind of planting region, invasive versus native versus all these different things. If you're civil, work with your landscape architect. If you're landscape architect, work with your engineer. Question 14. Is pre-treatment included in all of your green stormwater infrastructure practice designs? Always, most of the time, rarely, or never. This might be an odd question to ask, but I would say out of any of the work I've done with city-scale green infrastructure groups and kind of helped on a consulting basis or have helped develop new widgets and things for them to protect their systems, a lot of the conversations around pre-treatment. So those early adopters who were putting green infrastructure in for a while, like, oh my gosh, like all this trash and debris washing into my rain garden or clogging my permeable pavers or whatever it may be. And it's making maintenance happen too frequently. That drives up the cost of maintenance, long-term cost of ownership, those types of things. So pre-treatment is often not regulatorily required. I think that's why a lot of times folks don't put it in. It's like, oh, if it's not required, I'm not going to do it. But from a cost of ownership, it makes so much sense. Take this little device, this one's called the Rain Guardian. It's made by the Anoka Conservation District. It's a product we work with. It's probably the only little product pitch I'll put in this whole presentation. But it's a simple little precast device. It sits in a curb opening with a few different shapes and sizes and models available. But instead of just having a pile of riprap of stone or cobble that basically all that material still flushes into your system, you now have a dedicated chamber. It's a dry chamber, so it doesn't have a formal sump or anything like that. You've got a grate on top, filter wall on the backside, and now you're kind of collecting all that material in one place. You get some energy dissipation, get some collection and sediment debris, and it takes away the burden of having to maintain the rain garden or the biofilter or the bioretention system behind that device. And I've been working with systems like that for about 7 years. And when I go out in the field now and look at the biofilters that have these versus the ones that don't, the difference in the aesthetic and the look and the amount of maintenance needed is distinctly different. So I would definitely encourage all folks who are on the design side, or if you're hiring designers to do work for you, have a conversation about pre-treatment. Yes, you pay a little more on the front end to do that, but it pays itself off very quickly in terms of life cycle costs. Question 15, how do you handle bypass of larger storms? No bypass is provided. The systems spill back into the street and kind of travel down to the next inlet, or internal bypass is provided within the asset, either through an overflow riser or open berm. Really encouraged by this. I was hoping a lot of people would say internal bypass. Yes, you definitely need a bypass. So those who do no bypass, it's a bit of a concern. But even for the ones that spill back into the street, functionally that works. But I think the public sees that and they're like, oh, the rain garden isn't working. You're like, no, it's working. It's just at full capacity and now it's spilling onto the street. And if you're in more wintry, cold climate type areas, that's where you can get icing and things like that, which isn't really like from a sort of health and safety standpoint. So internal bypass is great. Usually that's done with some kind of domed overflow, set maybe 6 inches above the surface of the rain garden. But one thing I've learned in my inspection work post-installation is that same domed overflow is where a lot of floatables, mulch, and other things like to go to. And the small enough stuff can go through those openings and often clog whatever your subsurface system is. So I highly recommend that you put some kind of high flow basket or stream device in that overflow to collect these. These are really low cost add-ons, and it's a great relaxant. We've seen a lot of cities like Philly, even DC does this, Pittsburgh, they've done overflows. They put filter bags just so that you can collect that stuff, and make it a lot simpler. So that's something to think about. All right, so it's 3:30 and we are at question 16. So we're halfway through, right halfway on time. So we're right on track. Again, if you have any questions as we go through, please put them in the chat box, even just comments, things you want to agree with, disagree with, go ahead. All right, so we're going to talk about permeable surfaces for a little bit. Permeable surfaces, the first one in that set is, do you design with permeable surfaces? That's often, sometimes, or never. Let's see what the results were. Okay, so we've got 70% in the sometimes. That probably makes sense. Never, maybe a bit extreme, right? 17%, but there's probably a reason for that. So let's dig in a little bit. And when we're talking about permeable surface, I'm saying permeable or porous, alternative surfaces, options that aren't just hard surfaces, right? So it could be pavers, it could be porous asphalt, whatever it may be. So for those who do design with permeable surfaces, what are you mostly designing with? Porous asphalt, porous concrete, permeable pavers, stone-filled grid systems, or like, no, I just told you on the last one that I don't design with these. So 18% just reminding me that they don't work with them. But the big one here is 48% of folks in permeable pavers. And there's probably not a big surprise there. I think, yes, we do porous asphalt, porous concrete for larger areas, but for a lot of this on-street parking or permeable parking display areas or demonstration areas, often it seems like unit pavers. I will say though, in that space, look out for new innovations too. We work with open joint surfaces, so sometimes folks are concerned about the pavers with the stone fill because it clogs easily and it becomes a bit of a burden. Open joint systems are a good alternative where you can get really rapid flow through there, even during intense events, and the maintenance is a lot less. There's also some folks are concerned about like cast in place porous concrete and things like that. There are new innovations out there in that space too. This one's called the Stormcrete product, where it's actually a precast porous concrete panel. So you can get over all the challenges that come along with trying to place porous concrete in the field. And this has become pretty popular in municipal gutter lines and things like that. So just wanted to throw some on the board there to keep an eye on some of those new things. And of course, any of these little widgets or products that are put on the board, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me after the fact for more additional information. Question 18. If you don't design with permeable surfaces, so let's flip it back to the folks who aren't comfortable with it. What's the primary reason? You're concerned about maintenance, never considered designing with them, concerned about performance during intense rain events. I know some of the slower flowing sort of finer opening size systems, don't take all the runoff through or run the rainwater through, and you end up getting runoff anyways. The company I work for doesn't allow me to use them. I put that up there because I met one person who said that, so I put it added in there, and they're like, no, I just told you I use them all the time. So again, we've got 33% saying, yeah, I already use them. And probably no big surprise here, over half the respondents saying that maintenance is the concern. And that's fair. These systems aren't the best system everywhere. You've got to have the right conditions and the right client and the right maintenance program to make maintenance of permeable surfaces work. I will say there's some great new innovations, technologies out there, different backheads and spraying and sucking machines that take that material out. And so, whether you're hiring a subcontractor, a third party, or even buying equipment, say from a municipality that's looking to maintain a permeable surface program moving forward, there's a lot of new stuff out there beyond just your typical street sweepers and back trucks and things like that. Question 19. So back to plants. Is plant selection a priority in your design? So there's probably, based on what you saw for the collaboration between the civil and the landscape architect, probably no surprises with this result. Only a third of the time it's a priority. Again, this is a challenge, right? When we're thinking about green infrastructure and planted systems, vegetated systems, plant selection does need to be prioritized, right? Again, native, invasive, what plants are needed, what spacing, what are you looking for an aesthetic? What kind of plants can handle those drought periods, but also the heavy inundation. Which plants have more of an affinity for nutrient uptake, which is always good when you kind of pull out phosphorus and nitrogen and things like that. So again, that collaboration between the civil and the landscape architect, very, very important. Question 20. Again, on the plant side of things, are there provisions in your specifications for plant establishment? Always, sometimes never. This is a big unknown, I feel like, in a lot of projects, and maybe specifically in some of the bigger programs we're part of. And you can see here the results. Say, about half the time there are provisions for them. But even if there's provisions for plant establishment, I think sometimes the responsible party isn't always fully understood. And I think it's tricky, right? Do you make that the contractor's responsibility? Maybe, but then for how long, right? So you can't just throw a plant in the ground and hope it'll work well. It needs to probably be watered for a period of time, even with natives, until they're good, and then eventually they'll be able to handle themselves with rainfall that comes and goes. But if you put in some plants and you have a drought for the next 3 weeks, or you put in plants and they get hammered by some heavy gully washer, as we call them in Australia, the very next day, that's not going to be very good for those plants to get going. I know in one big city that does green infrastructure, at one point the contractors were on the hook for plant establishment for 2 years, and that was real tricky for those contractors because the systems were now online in kind of some nasty streets with all kinds of things coming into them, and it just really wasn't feasible for the contractors to hold that. So whoever's responsibility it is, it needs to be identified and certainly funded so that we get these systems off to a good start, and help them, to that point where they can now be more resilient and kind of handle themselves without a whole lot of attention apart from the meeting. Question 21. Are your pre-bid meetings mandatory? Always, sometimes, or never? When I say pre-bid, so this is not a pre-construction meeting, it's a pre-bid meeting. So this is when plans are done and out on the street and different contractors are looking at them. Are we A, having pre-bid meetings, and then B, if we're having them, are they mandatory? I'll explain why I asked this question. So here you can see pre-bid meetings mandatory only 17% of the time. I would encourage you to A, have pre-bid meetings, and B, make them mandatory. I've seen too many projects, especially projects where the pre-bid meetings aren't mandatory, and only some of the contractors come to those meetings. By going to that meeting, it almost reduces the chance of that contractor getting to work, right? Because if you go to that meeting, and also make sure that meeting's purposeful. There's so many meetings I've been to where it's just sort of just like catch up, hey, good to see you, good luck with your bid, looking forward to seeing your number. It's like, no, go through the specifics of the project, right? Plant establishment, what kind of media you have to use, how to protect the system, all those different things, E&S around these systems, whatever it may be. Have those meetings, have deliberate meetings, but have everyone be there, because I've found in the past that the contractors who come to the meeting learn all about the project. That usually drives their number up a little bit because they understand the specifics and the nuances of the project. Then the bids come in, and those who didn't go to that pre-bid meeting end up coming in low because they weren't in the meeting, didn't know those things. And now you end up with a contractor, if you pick that contractor, who may not be qualified to do the job. So have everyone come to the table, hear the same information. Now you know all those bids are qualified with all the appropriate information. Then when you select a contractor, work with them, right? Have a pre-construction meeting, and let's, as engineers and contractors, let's work together versus sort of separate from each other. Let's see how the engineer can get engaged. So speaking of engagement, question 22 was, are you involved in construction oversight of your project? Always, most of the time, rarely, or never. Let's see what the result is here. Okay, always 7.8%. Not great, right? Obviously, the most of the time, red, so that's a good thing. Rarely in the 31%, so you can kind of look at these in many different ways. I'm just going to snooze for a second. Give me one. Well, maybe not. That might return. This is one of those things where, again, it doesn't have to be the designer who handles the construction oversight. It could be a third-party inspector. It could be an owner's rep. It even could be a manufacturer's rep. So as an innovative technology company, we love to be in the field. We know our systems very well. And often engineers trust us to be in the field to make sure our systems are installed correctly because we've seen more of them. We definitely want to get that in the process. And we want to get engineers out in the field more too. Too many young engineers are stuck in their office, not going to see this stuff, and so they don't know when they're doing details kind of what that really is in the grand scheme of it. Contractors often have a lot of common sense they can share, Sometimes they push a little harder than others. But it's really good to be out in the field and seeing things get done. If you're not in the field, I think the risk we run is contractor goes through the entire project, then the engineer comes out at the end to do like a punch list of the project, and they're like pointing at, this is wrong and that's wrong, and why do you do this? And the contractor's like, well, hold on a sec, like, where were you? You could have told us that this wasn't good before we finished this element, before we did that. Now we're going to kind of go back and redo things. So I think it's fair on the contractor to be out there. Now, obviously, no one ever likes to hear, hey, that's not quite right, we need to redo it, and it needs to be done like this. But way better to identify that right at the time rather than at the end of the project. And if you're an engineer and you do go out in the field and you do spot some things that maybe aren't quite right, tell the contractor about it, give them a heads up. I've also heard and seen firsthand, things get picked up in the field, you go back to the office, you get busy with something, you type up a report, it gets reviewed, and then a week later, the contractor gets that report, and they're like, hey, wait, you were out in the field, why didn't you tell me this, right? So think about ways to be really efficient with that communication so that, again, and it's really just to try to build up that relationship and the integrity between the civil engineer and the contractor. Question 23, the systems you design protect during construction. This is one I think we also have to focus on as well. I think oftentimes we spend a lot of time in that corrosion sediment control plans doing slopes and perimeters like silt fence and socks and mulch berms and things like that. I don't often see a lot of detail on the plans that shows protection of the green stormwater infrastructure. There's something to think about, whether that's fabric. I don't know that silt fence is the right approach, because silt fences kind of disturbs all the area around it and you remove it eventually. But thinking about ways to have provisions for that, so these systems aren't compromised before they're put online. I'm going to skip over these next two because I think we don't need to get into that one for today. But question 26, after the project is complete, do you meet with your design team for post-project forensics to discuss what modifications need to be made for future projects? This is another one that was kind of a bit of a random question. But, I kept seeing these projects come out with the same details, even knowing that something on the last project didn't go so well, or there was ways to improve it. Right? So after you finish with the project, essentially you get together with your team to talk about what you learned from that project, right? When you're out in the field, what did you see? It just rained, like how did this system function? So you get together always, sometimes, or never, need to move on to the next one. And I gave that extra clarity on that third answer, need to move on to the next one, because I know as consultants, right, you get one done, you push it out, and you move on. You don't have a lot of time to sit around, and probably no one's paying you to do that post-project forensics. However, the results are a bit scary, right? So only 9.5% of the time are we getting together. And again, this is one of those things where, the old definition of insanity, whatever, do the same thing over and over again, expect a different result. We can kind of get into that pattern with green stormwater infrastructure. And so many of the stormwater manuals I see, the details I see, are the same details that existed 5 years ago. And I know we've learned so much since then, whether it's product choice, sections, using fabrics or not using fabric, what fabrics to use, whatever it may be. We need to really brush down the plans, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time. Maybe it's just 30 minutes to say, hey team, what happened on that last one we could have done different? What were the questions the contractor gave us that we could maybe clarify in the details better next time? Whatever it is, take a moment. If you're a leader in a space, or you're running a team, hit that pause button just for a few minutes and see you can make adjustments for the next one. All right, so the last three were really focused on maintenance. Maintenance is obviously a big part of the conversation, becoming more and more part of the conversation. So question 27 was, are the systems you design generally maintained to the level you're hoping for? Always, most of the time, rarely, or never. Let's take a look at how much blue is on this one. Ooh, I think hopefully most of you can see there's that little wedge there, right? So that's the always. Now, most of the time, it's 50%. So, okay, maybe cut that in half out of it here, but we're thinking about 75% of the time the design is saying, nope, they're not maintained in the way that we want to. That's a bit of a problem, right? Because maintenance for anything, whether it's cars, relationships, green infrastructure, everything has to be maintained if they're going to thrive and keep moving forward, right? So what I found is there's kind of two distinct groups. There's not a lot of people who dabble in maintenance. There's the folks who just don't do it. And then there's the folks that do. And the folks that do, this is a picture from Philadelphia here, are generally into it, have a certain routine to it, it's funded, it's budgeted, all that. And then there's other ones. This is a place in Florida that I won't mention where, but I was talking to a consultant and they said, oh yeah, they tried rain gardens in the city, but Yeah, they don't really like the way they look. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Well, where are they? So they gave me the address. I went over there. And I got there, pretty rough neighborhood. Didn't feel particularly safe at all. And it was pretty clear from looking at these rain gardens that they haven't been maintained ever. So of course they don't look good. And of course folks don't want to do them again. And I can see how, because it was in a pretty rough neighborhood, maybe they thought doing new compounds would help with kind of neighborhood revitalization and things like that. But I don't think the maintenance crews even want to be on this street, right? So we've got to think about a lot of different factors when it comes to these green stormwater systems. And again, if you never maintain them, I guarantee you they're not going to look good, after a year or so, especially when you get up into colder climates. After you get the winter sands and all those things through, you got to get out there and maintain. So let's put it back on the designers. Okay, so you're saying maintenance isn't happening to the level you want, but how often do you discuss maintenance with your clients? Always, sometimes, never. Pretty anticipated answers here. Most folks are having those conversations. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, that anticipated sneeze just came through. Didn't want to flush you all with that. So yeah, most people have that conversation. Now, what that conversation is, we don't know. Is that like a sit down face to face? Hey, here are the BMPs we're thinking about. What do you think? Here's the maintenance, or is that just handing over the O&M manual that sits on the shelf? It could be any of these things, right? But let's look at our owners now, our clients, our municipalities that you might be working for, you might be representing on this call today. Do you budget for ongoing maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure projects? Always, sometimes, or never. And this is probably one of those real, like, I don't know, link budgeting for this stuff. Let's see what the results were. All right, so let's just focus on the always, right? Where we rounded up fairly to 16%. Only 16% of the time we always budgeting for maintenance. That's a real problem, right? We're spending all this money, a lot of money going into stormwater infrastructure, a lot of green infrastructure programs out there, a lot of people dabbling in the space. But if we're not budgeting for maintenance, the chances of maintenance happening are very low. And so this is probably the one that needs to get turned around the most out of all the results from this survey. Because really, if we're not maintaining them, we're just digging a lot of really expensive holes in the ground, right? They work for a little bit, and then they slowly stop working, and then they just kind of become visual eyesores. So whatever role you have out there, think about ways that you can influence folks to make sure things are appropriately budgeted for. Question 30 was just one for the folks in the warmer climates, the colder climates. Does winter maintenance impact your BMP selection? Always, sometimes, never, or like no. I live in warmer places and deal with tropical storms. Yeah, so a lot of people in the Northeast. It's interesting. Not a lot of people kind of commented affirmative to this. I've noticed, especially when you think about permeable pavers, right? We think about concrete on pavers, winter road salt. Salt and concrete don't do well together. So if you're going to do or propose concrete permeable pavers, then I think it's important for the owner or maintenance manager of the team of the site to know that, okay, you've probably got to go a little light, do like light sanding versus heavy salting, right? And if an owner's cool with that, awesome. But if the owner's not cool with that, says, no, I hire whoever comes in to come and plow, we can't do anything without what they put down, then while permeable pavers may have looked good or fit in really well with the grading of the site, they may not be the best selection. So it's important just to think about, having a real conversation about maintenance and what your owners want. All right, so the final question, and if you guys get your chat boxes ready, I'm going to actually ask you a question and see what people put in there. But I asked one short-term question or short answer question. So in terms of not multiple choice, there was a bonus question, and that question was, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing green stormwater infrastructure projects and programs today? So I took all of the answers and kind of put them into different little buckets, and then I've essentially populated a family feud style board to reveal the results. If you have any thoughts about what you think some of the highest scoring comments may be, feel free to type those in the chat box right now. Whatever you think it may be. What do you think folks responded to as the biggest challenges facing green stormwater infrastructure projects and programs today? All right, I don't see anybody typing quite yet. So I'll start going through. If you have any thoughts, feel free to type them in the chat box as we go. But we'll start from the bottom up. So from the most, I guess, least common answer to the most common. So some folks, 2 results said, hey, what about geotechnical challenges, right? Poor soils, high groundwater, how you can infiltrate or not. While green infrastructure can be done without infiltration, it's generally favorable if you can infiltrate once you get through your system. Resiliency, and that was more that folks say, hey, people don't realize how much resiliency benefit green infrastructure can offer versus them being non-resilient, non-resilient, inresilient. Installation, so contractor challenges, right? Getting them in the ground, contractor coordination. Space, so just, again, that challenge in the urban setting of not having a lot of room to work with. Knowledge gap, right? Green infrastructure is something that's still, I think, between the engineer, the landscape architect, the public, the contractor, there's still a lot of collaboration in terms of sharing of information there. Third highest answer was regulation. So, and this was more driven to the fact that a lot of people felt like, hey, look, I want to use green infrastructure. I want to use low impact development techniques. However, the stormwater manual in my town or my county or my city or my state is 15 years old, and there's really no mechanism for awarding credit or regulatory approval for a project with these types of things. So we need to see stormwater manuals and guidelines be revised and be improved to include these types of things. And then the final 2, probably no surprise, even for those who are a little nervous about typing in the chat box, is cost and maintenance. And maintenance was more the way that folks misunderstand maintenance, or the comparison of maintaining green infrastructure as compared to nothing, versus the fact that green infrastructure to surface can actually be pretty affordable when you compare it to other types of stormwater management systems or way to manage wet weather. And the cost, again, was not this idea that green infrastructure is really costly or expensive. Well, folks don't necessarily fully understand the cost benefits of green infrastructure. And again, when you compare it to other things, that's green infrastructure, and there usually has to be a balance there. It can actually be a pretty good way to manage wet weather type of conditions. All right, so wrapping things up, last slide, and then I'll kind of hand it over to Rebecca and anyone else who wants to type chat questions in the meeting chat. Take-home message, right? Pretty simple. We need to think about ways to better collaborate from design all the way through to post-installation maintenance, so that whole process, right? And then bring what we learn in maintenance back to the front end. We need to pause and take what we're learning in the field and modify, adapt, revise our approaches for better outcomes. And like I touched on one of the questions, pre-treatment's a pretty big one. I keep seeing that as a common theme in a lot of the bigger cities. So no matter what you're doing and where you're working, think about that pre-treatment thing. It really helps the long-term cost of ownership of GSI. We need to consider using new approaches. Sure. So again, fill yourself with new ideas, new approaches. If you're looking for information on anything I work with, you can reach out to me and I think you can have a conversation offline. We need to look at ways to leverage the triple bottom line benefits, right? So not just the environmental function, but the social benefit, the financial benefits that can come along with the incentives. A lot of extra things that we can extract out of green stormwater infrastructure. We need to better communicate maintenance obligations, but we need to make sure we're budgeting for it, right? So no matter who you are, no matter what your role is, if a conversation comes up about maintenance, make sure folks say, yeah, okay, we need to actually budget for this. And so many grant-funded projects I see, all the money goes into the installation. What if we were to make the project installation or construction budget a little bit smaller, build a slightly smaller rain garden, and put a couple of $1,000s in some kind of escrow account that can be used to fund maintenance for the first couple of years? Maybe that's the way to go about it, but making sure that's reserved for some maintenance. And then if we think about that final sort of general question, we need to be working together to overcome some of those challenges and perceived challenges facing green stormwater infrastructure, those primarily being cost to maintenance. So those are some things to think about. Again, like I said at the beginning, hopefully a couple of these data points are interesting for you, and I challenge everyone on this call to think about ways that you can take that data and in your kind of areas of influence, so your world, your professions, your companies, think about ways that you can help drive some change there. And again, all those different pieces, a little bit at a time, is going to help us get better, more sustainable outcomes and fully realize what green infrastructure can do for our communities, neighborhoods, cities, towns, and of course, the ultimate downstream water bodies that we're trying to protect. So that's me. Thank you so much. We've got about 6 minutes to go. So if you've got any questions, put them in the chat. And I think at this point, Rebecca, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob. That was really informative. We're hoping that all of you enjoyed it. Yeah, if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat. If you don't, then we'll be good to go. But if you missed any part of this recording, it's going to be posted on our website in about 24 hours, which is stormwaterawareness.org. And you can watch this workshop as well as all the other ones and register for any of the remaining classes for this week and watch our 3 keynote videos. There's one that was released on Monday and then on Wednesday, and then our last keynote will be released tomorrow. So you can find all that on our website. And it doesn't look like we have any questions, so we might let you all go a couple minutes early. But thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Have a great week, everybody.